All right, the last major cultural legacy of antiquity that came to influence the Middle Ages was the German cultural legacy. And so the title of this is Germania, which is the Latin word for the German lands or the lands of the German peoples. The map in antiquity, at least, from like the 2nd century CE maybe on, looked something like this. So you have this borderland, right, that runs roughly along the Rhine River here. See, the Rhine flows out of the mountains here and down into the North Sea. And then along the Danube River over here to some extent. Dacia was north of the Danube. It flows down here. But, the Rhine and the Danube are kind of these borders or these barriers between the lands of the German-speaking peoples and the lands of the Romans, lands controlled by Romans. Now, maps often, give a false impression, I think, of what the German lands were like when they list these peoples here, like the Marcomanni or the Bastarnai or the Lugii or the Vandali or whatever. There are identifiable groups of Germanic-speaking peoples in antiquity, but they tend to be very fluid, and they tend not to last for a really long time. These people who lived north of the Danube were farmers, though they had to compete with growing seasons that were noticeably shorter than in the Mediterranean. It's quite a bit colder in northern Europe than it is in the Mediterranean region. And so, this left them often on the edge of their existence. And when they were in crisis, and perhaps even sometimes when they weren't in a directly acute crisis, they would band together under the leadership of a military chieftain of some kind and fight wars with each other, sometimes threaten the borderlands with Rome. But these were very fluid identities. It's not like, the Marcomanni or the Cherusci or the Frisi or something like that, had these ethnic identities from time out of mind or even for very long. It's only that some of these groups or, these names become associated with the Germanic kingdoms that replace Rome, the Western Roman Empire. That's the main reason why we have this idea that these are distinct groups. They don't really become distinct groups, at least not in a kind of permanent fashion, until the 4th and 5th and 6th centuries when they take over parts of the Roman Empire. The other thing to note here is that there was a relationship along these borderlands between the Germanic-speaking peoples and the Romans. This was a zone of migration. And this is true for most situations in world history where you have a relatively stable political entity, in this case the Roman Empire, next to lands that are less economically vibrant. The flow of migration is going to go from the poorer place to the richer place. And that's true in the modern era, it's true in antiquity, it's true in the Middle Ages. And so this is a zone of migration, right? We might think of this as the border here, a border akin to, what we see between Mexico and the United States, or today, the immigration tends to flow from Africa or from the Middle East into Europe. There's migration zones like this all over the world, even in the modern era. But this was a major zone of migration. Germanic speakers, not necessarily large bands of them, and certainly not the romantic images we have of these barbarian hordes, storming into Rome and killing everything in sight. That's more of an imaginary thing, I think, than anything that existed in reality. At least it's not the rule; it's rather the exception. But Germanic speakers would try to make their way into the Roman Empire to find employment, to find greater stability. And it became the custom of the army commanders on the borderlands, because remember, the army is sort of stationed right along here, right along that border, to hire Germans, initially as kind of like mercenaries, but this gave them a possible path to citizenship. And over time, the military became increasingly ethnically German. to the point where by the end of the 3rd century or so, probably the majority of the people who were part of the army were of Germanic origin. Maybe, a couple of generations removed from that, but this was still their ethnic, kind of identity. And even the commanders, the generals of the army, were many of them, and even some of the most prominent ones, of Germanic origin. Romans in power didn't necessarily like this, but this was a necessity because trying to recruit people into the Roman military was difficult. It was a 20-year, minimum commitment. It meant they had to move. They did not have a stable existence. And so, they couldn't necessarily recruit people from within the empire, especially as it became more prosperous and more stable. They had to hire these people on the borderlands, right? And so the military becomes this melting pot of Romans and Germans. Germans who would serve in the army were often granted citizenship, but they still retained some of the cultural practices and beliefs and things of their Germanic roots. Now, there's a crisis in the 4th century in the German lands. Specifically, this involves horse nomads from Central Asia over here coming into this region that we now think of as Eastern Europe and threatening some of these Germanic peoples. And when threatened, as we've already said, they tended to band together under military chieftains. They have a military ethos anyway, right? And it's through these means, through the threat of these people who are simply called in the ancient sources the Huns. And we should not mistake this group of Huns from the later group of Huns. It's about a century later that the Huns become particularly powerful and even threaten Italy under the famous Attila the Hun, right? This is an earlier group of these horse nomads. But there are 2 distinct groups that show up in the ancient sources here, who are called Goths. Okay, so we have the Visigoths, which means the Western Goths, and the Ostrogoths, or the Eastern Goths. And it seems that the Huns were sort of raiding into this area. These are nomadic peoples, and so they're mounted warriors. They were reliant on their animals, in this case horses, for transportation and for their livelihoods. They raided into these, Germanic-speaking agricultural communities, and this caused a crisis, right? So these people band together under military chieftains. The Ostrogoths seems threatened first, and they began to move to the west. This caused the Visigoths to band together, and the Visigoths decide, and this is sort of customary already. They would move into Roman territory and take up positions in the Roman army and things like that. But never had there been a group this large necessarily trying to get into Roman territory. And so they were halted in this advance by the Roman authorities on the border. They're kind of massed here on the Danube. They're already in the Roman province of Dacia, so they're in Roman borders, but the Romans really didn't want them to cross the Danube. And in the meantime, they're like, well, the emperor's, going to handle your situation, but this went on for some time. The local merchants were selling them, bad food, and they were getting sick, and they were getting increasingly desperate. And so finally, this group of Visigoths just breaks across the Danube and starts to raid here in the region of Thrace. The emperor at this point, whose name is Valens, takes an army up here. His brother was marching with reinforcements that would have given him a much stronger force, but Valens was impatient and decided not to wait for his brother. And so in the year 378, he engaged this Visigothic force. He had drastically underestimated the number of people they would have, and Valens suffers defeat at the Battle of Adrianople, year 378. Valens himself is killed, and the Visigoths are still on the loose here. And the Ostrogoths are also moving into this territory, and so there's another threat kind of on the border here as well. And this throws Rome into a crisis that lasts for the next several decades. Now, the emperor who succeeded Valens was the emperor Theodosius, and Theodosius is one of the more important emperors of late antiquity. I mean, after Constantine, he's probably the one who enacts the most important changes. And so he tried to use diplomacy to settle these people in Roman territory, to kind of assuage their concerns. Some of the Goths do that, but other Goths decide that, this is a good gig we got going here, that we can just kind of have our way with people if we're strong enough militarily. Theodosius didn't want to make the same mistake that Valens had made, and that is engage them. He tried to use diplomacy much more than military in this regard. And the Romans begin to enter into kind of negotiations with the leaders of these groups. And there's some amount of acculturation going on here, that one of the arrangements that they come to at times is that, the sons of the military chieftains will be sent to Constantinople to be educated as Romans. I mean, they really want to be Romans. They want to live in Rome. They don't want to, upend things necessarily, but they're also desperate, right? And so Theodosius manages this crisis fairly effectively. But after Theodosius dies in the year 395, he bequeaths the Western Empire, so from this red line here on the map, to his younger son Honorius, and his older son, whose name escapes me for the moment, was given the Eastern Empire. And Theodosius had definitely invested a great deal more in the Eastern Empire, and really this had been the general trend from Constantine on to favor the East. This was, more populous, more economically vibrant, more culturally rich. The East was definitely the better part of the empire, even though Rome itself was over here. And so, he splits the empire into two. Now, he didn't necessarily mean for this to be a permanent thing, but from the time of Diocletian, this had already been kind of the trend to divide up the empire into more manageable units. And the West is what ends up suffering from this, because Honorius was not a very effective emperor. He came into the sway of, on the one hand, a Germanic general named Stilicho, who he was of Germanic origin, but he was also married into prestigious, patrician Roman families. It's not like he was a bloodthirsty barbarian invading Roman politics or something like that, right? But because he was of Germanic origin, there were some elite Romans, especially members of the Senate, who did not like Stilicho's power. And so the Goths, generally, under the leadership of a guy named Alaric, tended to move west. This is partly with the encouragement of Theodosius, that they were moving in this direction anyway. They kind of come into the borderlands up here of Italy, and Stilicho was managing this whole situation. Honorius, was really kind of aloof from all of this. He was quite young and rather callow. But so Stilicho's up here, he's the one really managing the crisis with the Goths, trying to find some solution to incorporate this belligerent population into Rome. And the senators convince Honorius that Stilicho is intending to overthrow him and proclaim himself emperor. Oh, the horror to have a German on the throne, right? That was some of the thinking here. And so Honorius turns on Stilicho, sends soldiers to have him arrested, and he ends up executing Stilicho. But he chooses not to replace him, or to really put anybody into the position of negotiating with Alaric. And on Alaric's part, it's like the phone line went dead. We don't know what they're intending. And so Alaric finally just takes his troops down into Italy, comes down, and actually sacks the city of Rome in the year 410. This causes all sorts of shockwaves all over the Mediterranean. It's in response to this that Augustine writes The City of God, for instance, where he's saying, well, we have to expect that a city that is founded on human principles rather than divine principles is going to fall eventually, and so this isn't a big surprise. But others are just aghast at this whole turn of events. Importantly, though, Alaric did not do a lot of damage to the city of Rome. The Goths were already Christian, for one. They had been converted to the Arian form of Christianity, not the Orthodox Catholic form, but Arian Christian. And so they respected the churches in Rome. They respected Rome as a holy city. They simply, and it's not really simply, but they plundered the residences of the elite Roman senators and, did some damage to the city, but they left the churches alone. They left most of the monuments alone. And what they really wanted to do was get down here to North Africa, because North Africa was the most agriculturally rich area of the Western Empire. This is kind of the breadbasket. A lot of the food that went to large cities in Italy and other parts of the empire, like Rome, came from North Africa. And these, being Germans, are accustomed to farming. They're really just looking for good farmland to settle down in. But Alaric's, his troops get down here to southern Italy. They realize, we've got to sail across the Mediterranean to get there. We don't know how to build a boat. And so they end up going back up the peninsula. They bypass Rome this time, and their intention is to go around to the Strait of Gibraltar to cross into North Africa. But it turns out this kind of sequence of events had set into motion some other things in the Western Empire, where there were other Germanic groups who were banding together and coming en masse into Roman territory. Now, like the Goths, these people were already Christian, and many of them, at least, were quite Romanized, meaning they, were acculturated to Rome. They were not coming in to plunder and pillage. They were coming in to settle. They did some plundering and pillaging on the way, certainly, because they were desperate and hungry. But their intent is not to destroy. Their intent is to settle. So one of these groups, called the Vandals, ends up coming down here, crossing the Strait of Gibraltar before the Goths can get there. And so they occupy North Africa. The Goths end up in Iberia, where they established the Visigothic Kingdom of Spain. And there are other groups. Some of these groups are rather short-lived. The Alemanni is a group identified in the sources. They don't last very long, and the name itself indicates that they're probably not the most stable in terms of their identity. It just means like all the people. The Franks, though, do end up establishing rule over this territory, right? So that by the early 6th century, this is what the Western Roman Empire looks like. Okay. There was even a Germanic general who he's in the Roman army, but he finally did what Honorius thought Stilicho was trying to do, and that is he simply overthrew the last of the emperors in the West. Fittingly, a guy named Romulus, called after the founder of the city. He removed him from power in the year 476. He sent the battle standards of the Roman army to Constantinople and said, I've got this, I'm in charge now. And in response to this, the emperor in the east reached out to the leader of the Ostrogoths, who were kind of still in this territory, and he invited him to go and conquer Italy, to remove Odoacer. This guy's name was Theodoric, and Theodoric's a really important figure. Theodoric was very Romanized. He had lived much of his early life in Constantinople as a kind of part of this exchange program that the Romans and the Germans had with each other. And he really thought as much like a Roman as he did like a German. And so he conquered Italy, set himself up as basically the caretaker of Italy under the auspices of the emperor in the east, right? So he is the king of the Ostrogoths, but he doesn't consider himself the king of Italy necessarily, okay? Now, there are a couple different ways to view this sequence of events, right? Going back to the 18th century, trying to find, when it all went wrong, when Western civilization fell into the Dark Ages, as it was considered, during the Enlightenment and even earlier during the Renaissance. The historian Edward Gibbon chose the word fall of Rome in his famous multi-volume work called On the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. And being an Enlightenment thinker, he tended to blame Christianity for a good deal of this, for the fall of civilization, but he also targeted the Germans for being these bloodthirsty barbarians who just wanted to destroy rather than create. This image of these Germans has perpetuated. You even see it in pop culture frequently, where the Germans are shown as these ragtag, fur-wearing, axe-wielding, horned helmet. They often get conflated with Vikings, by the way. but these barbarian hordes who were just trying to destroy civilization. In more recent decades, historians have nuanced the picture of these people. Now, the breakup, the fragmentation of the Western Empire was certainly a disaster in many ways. This is not all a positive thing, right? For one, with the breakup of this, a lot of the kind of flow of food from these agriculturally rich areas like North Africa to other parts of the empire, especially to the city of Rome and other major cities in Italy, some of that dries up. And this leads to the depopulation of many of these cities. Rome, still in the 5th century, probably had a population of, 500,000 people or so. By the 6th century, it's down to like 10,000. And so the de-urbanization is one of the symptoms of what's been happening in Europe, or in the Mediterranean, I should say, with the breakup of the Roman Empire. But on the other hand, it's not all bad. I mean, there's definitely some element of disaster to this. But on the other hand, for the most part, these Germanic kings who now ruled parts of what had been the Western Roman Empire were very Romanized. They saw Rome as a model for good governance. They continued to try to put into place and to perpetuate the sorts of things that had made Rome successful, right? Even pulling economic levers to increase prosperity. We see this in, for instance, the letters of Theodoric, who is the leader of the Ostrogoths, who I talked about, right? He writes letters where he's commanding the merchants to not sell food outside of Italy because we need to have enough for our people. And so it's not like these people are just like raiding and pillaging everything in sight like the romantic notions of them would have. They're trying to be good governors over their territory, and for the most part, they're following after the model of the Romans. They wanted to be Romans. Another example of how much they wanted to be, how much they admired Rome and wanted to be Romans. One of the early leaders of the Franks, whose name is Clovis, and we're going to look at Clovis a little bit more in a later video lecture. But he sends messengers off to Constantinople asking to be acknowledged by the emperor as the leader of this part, the ruler of this part of the Roman Empire, really under the auspices of the emperor, right? And the emperor finally, sends a message back that says, "I've declared you a consul of Rome." Now, during the Republic, the consul was the chief executive, but by this point, that title was almost meaningless. But Clovis was absolutely thrilled with this. And he threw a big party. He ordered in a lot of wine. He put on a Roman toga for the occasion. He held a triumph for himself, which is this like ticker tape parade sort of thing that was done for victorious commanders in the Roman Republic, right? He really wanted to be Roman and imitated the Romans. And so the orientation of these kingdoms was very much toward Rome. They saw themselves as the successors, the worthy successors to the Western Empire. And in many ways, they were much more effective than the Western Empire had been, at least in the last century or so of its existence, at keeping the peace, at making sure that people were living in as prosperous circumstances as they could, though they certainly fell short many times of that, right? A couple other comments before we end here. The Roman Britannia itself is divided up into 7 smaller kingdoms. Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Essex, Kent, Sussex, Wessex, Cumbria is the other one up here. Okay, so this area becomes much, these kingdoms on the continent are much larger. These Anglo-Saxon kingdoms are relatively tiny. I think I'm going to save this for a later lecture. But we should note, I think I'll do this now, okay, that the Germans had their own system of law. Sometimes they adopted Roman forms, but they had their own system of law, and this becomes influential for many centuries in the Middle Ages, and even has, its reflections in modern European law in some cases. Certainly in, for instance, English common law is Germanic based. But one of the sources I assigned you for this week is this thing called the Salic Law. This is the law of the Franks. This was codified again under Clovis, the guy I just mentioned. But one thing we see here is that they put a monetary value on every illegal action. And this is because these people have a very militaristic ethos to them. Their entire society was centered on their military leadership, and there was frequent fighting among them. Okay, we find lots of evidence, for instance, of this thing called blood feud existing between people even of the same ethnic identity. So that, these Franks would hold kind of declare blood feuds against other families within the Frankish kingdom. And so to make sure they didn't have constant fighting among themselves, the laws put a monetary value on even human life. And so the Salic Law is just a set of decrees here. Again, these would be by the Frankish kings. But in practice, this seemed to work pretty well. Where if somebody violates a law, they have to pay a fee. Okay. Certainly there would be vigilante justice and people would be killed sometimes to enact justice. But the law itself was that, if you made a violation, you had to pay a fee. If anyone be summoned before the thing is a collection of, kind of the chief nobles of the realm. It's an early form of what we might call parliament. And doesn't come, they have to pay 600 dinars, which make 15 shillings. We have, items about theft here. If somebody steals a pig that can live without its mother, meaning it's not a suckling pig, then you have to pay 40 dinars. But if they steal a suckling pig, meaning one that's younger, they have to pay much more, right? So the tendency here is the younger the thing, the greater the value of it. So there's stuff about thefts. Rape has a value to it. If 3 men carry off a freeborn girl, they should be compelled to pay 30 shillings. If there are more than 3 men, each one will pay 8 shillings. And so, anyway, I don't want to do the horrible math involved in that, right? But those who commit rape shall be compelled to pay 2,500 dinars. So this is a really serious offense, and fittingly so. Wounds. If you strike another with a poisoned arrow, you have to pay a really hefty fee, right? If you strike somebody on the head so that the brain appears, then it's 1,200 dinars. They get really specific with this. If it shall have been between the ribs or in the stomach that they wound somebody, it's 1,200 dinars. And if they cause them to bleed, then it's 600 dinars. I don't know. There's just a lot of things like this. A lot of this is like if you kill this type of person. Okay, so if you slay a boy under 10 years, 24,000 dinars. A free woman who is pregnant, 28,000 dinars. I think this is maybe the highest of these, right? There's even fees for insults. If you call somebody a fox, I guess that was an insult. You have to pay 3 shillings. That's actually a fairly hefty amount of money to pay for just saying a slur to somebody or something like that. Okay. So this seemed to be a way that the Franks came up with to keep the peace, to ensure that people received justice. It didn't necessarily always work, but this idea of everything having a value, the Germanic term for this is Wehrgeld, or man money. Everything has a value, and so if you violate a law and you hurt somebody, you have to pay that value. And that, again, is, this is something that remains in force, at least in part, all through the Middle Ages. Okay, I think I'm going to stop there. We have a lot to say about the Christianization of the Germanic people, but I'm gonna make that the first lecture in the second week of the course. All right, thanks.